In the vast tapestry of the galaxy, there existed a truth that every civilized species had learned to accept: the universe was not kind to the weak. For 3,000 cycles, the Galactic Concordat had maintained order among 47 member species, each contributing their unique gifts to a greater whole. The crystalline Zathkari provided computational power beyond imagination. The ethereal Malthine offered wisdom that spanned millennia. The mighty Bractol served as peacekeepers with their impenetrable carapaces and unwavering honor. But there were always those who fell through the cracks. Ambassador Quintera of the Veltai stood before the Concordat Council, her 6 arms trembling as she clutched the datapad containing humanity's admission request. Her species had once been outcasts too, refugees from a dying world seeking sanctuary among the stars. Now, centuries later, she held a position of respect within the council chambers. She understood better than most what rejection felt like. The petition from Terra? High Arbiter Zenmalik's voice carried the weight of authority that had guided the Concordat for 8 centuries. His form, a shimmering amalgamation of energy and consciousness, pulsed with measured consideration. This is the 4th world this cycle to request admission. The 3rd to be rejected, murmured Councillor Rick Sitvon from the Bractod delegation, his massive frame creating shadows across the chamber floor. Their military assessment scores are concerning. Quinthera's secondary arms fluttered, a nervous habit her species had never quite evolved past. With respect, Councillor, their defensive capabilities are not the issue. They've demonstrated remarkable innovation. Innovation born from constant warfare, interrupted Councillor Yavandra, her melodic voice carrying undertones of disdain. The Malthine representative's translucent form rippled with disapproval. Their historical records speak of nothing but conflict, nuclear weapons, biological warfare. They've nearly destroyed their own world multiple times. The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of the translation matrix. Quintera felt the weight of 46 other species representatives watching, waiting. She had fought for the humans' admission for months, ever since their first contact protocols had been established. There was something about them, something that reminded her of her own people's desperate flight among the stars. They are a young species, she said finally, her voice steady despite her racing hearts. All young species struggle with. The Contenth were a young species when we welcomed them. Zenmalik's energy form pulsed with memory. They brought art that moved our souls. The Wixtal were young. They brought technology that revolutionized medical care across the galaxy. What do the humans bring, Ambassador? What gift do they offer beyond their capacity for violence? Quintera's datapad trembled in her grip. She had read every report, every cultural analysis, every military assessment. The humans were resilient beyond measure, creative in ways that defied logic, and possessed an adaptability that was almost supernatural. But how could she explain that to a council that had already made up its mind? They bring, she started, then stopped. How could she put it into words? They bring hope. The laughter that rippled through the chamber was not cruel, but it was dismissive. Even Rixthon, whose species valued honor above all else, allowed a low rumble of amusement to escape his massive chest. Hope, Yvandra repeated, her form shimmering with what might have been pity. Ambassador Quinthera, we appreciate your compassion for struggling species. Your own people's journey to acceptance within the Concordat is well documented and admired. But hope is not a quantifiable resource. Hope does not contribute to galactic stability or advancement. The motion to deny the humans admission to the Galactic Concordat is hereby called to vote, Zenmalik announced, his voice echoing through the crystalline chamber. All in favor? 43 lights pulsed in agreement. Only Quinthera's remained dark, joined by 2 others, representatives from species that had themselves once been refugees, once been desperate for acceptance. The motion passes. The humans of Terra will be informed that their petition for membership has been denied. They will be granted the standard isolation protocols. No interference, no contact, no acknowledgement of their existence beyond this decision. As the council began to disperse, Quintera remained in her seat, staring at the datapad. Somewhere in the outer rim of the galaxy, on a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable star, an entire species would wake to find themselves truly alone among the stars. Captain Jonathan Cross stood in the observation deck of humanity's most advanced space station, watching the stars through reinforced transparent steel that had taken Earth's best engineers 15 years to perfect. Behind him, the soft murmur of his crew provided a backdrop of normalcy that felt increasingly fragile with each passing day. The rejection had hit harder than anyone had expected. Not because humanity had truly believed they would be accepted. Most of Earth's leadership had been cautiously pessimistic from the start, but the isolation protocol had been a surprise. Complete communications blackout. No cultural exchange. Nothing. Captain. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Park approached with a data tablet, her expression carefully neutral. "We're receiving another transmission on the emergency frequencies." Cross turned from the stars, his weathered face showing the strain of recent months. At 45, he had seen humanity's first contact with alien life, had watched his species reach for the stars with desperate hope, and had witnessed their rejection with a dignity that had surprised even him. Same as the others? Unknown vessel, unidentified configuration. They're not broadcasting on any concordant frequencies, but they're definitely not human either. Park handed him the tablet. "This makes the 7th ship in 2 weeks, sir. All broadcasting distress signals. All requesting sanctuary." Cross studied the readings. Each ship had been different. Unique designs that suggested different species, different technologies, different desperation. The first had arrived just days after the Concordat's rejection became public knowledge throughout human space. A small, damaged vessel carrying what appeared to be 3 survivors of a species humanity had never encountered. The council had been divided. Some argued for caution. Humanity was already isolated, already viewed with suspicion by the galaxy's established powers. Taking in refugees could be seen as an act of aggression, or worse, as harboring criminals or dissidents. Others, led by President Maria Santos herself, had argued for compassion. "We know what it feels like to be turned away," she had said during the emergency session. "We know what it means to be alone among the stars. If we can help, if we can offer sanctuary to those who need it, then that's who we choose to be." "Sir?" Ork's voice brought him back to the present. "Your orders." Cross looked out at the stars again, then back at his communications officer. Somewhere out there, another desperate ship carried another species that had been turned away, cast out, forgotten by a galaxy that valued order over compassion. "Signal the ship," he said finally. "Tell them they're welcome here. Coordinate with Refugee Processing Station Alpha for intake procedures." Park nodded and turned to leave, but Cross's voice stopped her. "Lieutenant Commander?" "Yes, sir?" "Send a message to Earth Command. Tell them we need to accelerate the construction of additional refugee facilities. I have a feeling this is just the beginning." As Park left to carry out his orders, each ship that arrived brought stories that broke his heart and strengthened his resolve. The Korvac family, whose world had been strip-mined by Concordat-approved corporations, leaving them homeless and destitute. The young Velinari scientist who had been exiled for proposing theories that challenged established doctrine. The elderly Zorn Thep, who had spent 40 years trying to gain admission to the Concordat, only to be repeatedly rejected for being culturally incompatible. Humanity had taken them all in. Not because it was profitable. Not because it advanced their standing in galactic politics. Simply because it was right. "Contact Earth Command," Cross said to the empty observation deck, his voice carrying a weight that the stars themselves seemed to absorb. "Tell President Santos that we need to discuss expanding our refugee program. And tell." He paused, watching another unknown ship appear on the edge of their sensor range. "Tell her that we're going to need more ships." Quinthara stood in her private chambers, reviewing reports that had begun arriving through unofficial channels. The humans, it seemed, had not responded to their isolation as expected. Rather than turning inward and focusing solely on their own development, they had opened their arms to the galaxy's unwanted. Her aide, a young Veltai named Morthak, entered with the latest intelligence briefing. "Ambassador, the numbers are significant." "How significant?" Quinthara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 43 different species have been granted sanctuary in human space over the past 90 days. The humans have constructed 7 refugee stations and are reportedly building more. They're not just offering temporary shelter, they're providing long-term settlement opportunities, full integration into human society. Gwenthera's 4 eyes focused on the report with growing fascination. This was unprecedented. Even during the great refugee crises that had periodically swept the galaxy, no single species had ever taken in so many displaced peoples. The logistics alone should have been overwhelming for a species as young and resource-limited as humanity. What's the Concordat's response? Morthak's arm membranes fluttered with nervousness. Officially? There is no response. The humans remain under isolation protocols. Unofficially, he paused, consulting his datapad. Several council members have expressed concern about what they're calling a destabilization of established refugee patterns, meaning species that would normally petition the Concordat for years, gradually working their way through bureaucratic channels, are bypassing the system entirely. They're going straight to human space. Gwenthera moved to her chamber's viewport, staring out at the swirling nebula that marked the border between Concordat space and the neutral zone. Somewhere beyond that boundary, humanity was quietly revolutionizing the galaxy's approach to displaced peoples, and they were doing it not through politics or diplomacy but through simple, direct compassion. There's more, Morthak said quietly. The humans have issued a general broadcast throughout the galaxy. It's being transmitted on emergency frequencies that the Concordat can't legally block without violating interstellar communication protocols. What does it say? Morthak activated his translation matrix, and suddenly the chamber filled with a voice that was unmistakably human. Young female speaking with a clarity and sincerity that cut through the usual diplomatic doublespeak that dominated galactic communications. To any being, any species, any family among the stars who finds themselves without a home, Earth welcomes you. We know what it means to be turned away, to be told you don't belong, to watch the lights of civilization pass you by. We know because we've been there. We've felt the cold silence of rejection, the weight of isolation, the bitter taste of being deemed unworthy. But we also know something else. We know that worthiness isn't determined by the powerful. It's proven by how we treat the powerless. We know that civilization isn't measured by the size of your fleets or the efficiency of your bureaucracy. It's measured by the breadth of your compassion. So to those the universe has turned its back on, we have not turned our backs on you. You are welcome here. You are wanted here. You belong here. This is President Maria Santos of Earth, and this is our promise to the stars. The transmission ended, leaving Gwenthera's chambers in silence. She had heard political speeches from every species in the Concordat, had listened to thousands of hours of diplomatic rhetoric and carefully crafted statements designed to say nothing while sounding profound. This was different. This was real. Ambassador. Morthak's voice was barely above a whisper. What are your orders? Gwenthera continued staring out at the nebula, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. The humans were playing a dangerous game. By openly welcoming the galaxy's outcasts, they were challenging the Concordat's fundamental assumptions about order, about worthiness, about who deserved a place among the stars. But they were also doing something else. They were proving that there was another way. Prepare my personal shuttle, she said finally, and file a request for extended leave from my council duties. Ambassador, where are we going? Gwenthera turned from the viewport, her 6 arms moving with sudden purpose. We're going to see what the humans have built with their hope. As the Harmony's edge altered course toward human space, Gwenthera couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to witness something that would change the galaxy forever. The universe had indeed turned its back on the humans, but perhaps, in doing so, it had created something far more dangerous than any weapon, far more revolutionary than any technology. It had created a species with nothing left to lose and everything to give. The docking bay of Station Alpha thrummed with activity that would have been impossible to imagine just 6 months ago. Human engineers worked alongside Korthek metallurgists to expand the station's capacity. Velnari scientists shared theoretical frameworks with Earth's top physicists. Zinthapepal elders taught human children games that had been played for millennia on worlds whose names Earth had never known. Commander Lisa Hayes walked through the organized chaos, marveling at how quickly things had evolved. As the station's administrator, she had overseen the integration of thousands of refugees from dozens of species. Each presented unique challenges: biological, cultural, technological. that humanity had somehow managed to overcome through a combination of stubborn determination and creative problem-solving. "Commander Hayes?" The voice belonged to Kelthar, a young Nethys whose species had been cast out of Concordat space for their excessive emotional volatility. In practical terms, this meant they experienced feelings more intensely than most species found comfortable. To humans, it made them remarkably empathetic and insightful. "What is it, Kelthar?" "We have a situation in Docking Bay 7. The new arrivals, they're different." The ship that had docked was massive, easily 3 times larger than any refugee vessel they had previously encountered. Its hull bore markings that Hayes didn't recognize, but her universal translator was picking up multiple languages, multiple species, all broadcasting from the same ship. "How many?" she asked. "Preliminary scans indicate approximately 3,000 individuals. But Commander," Kelthar's emotional resonance patterns shifted to something Hayes had learned to recognize as profound sadness. "They're not from one species. They're from 12 different species, all traveling together." Hayes stopped walking. 12 species. On one ship? That's unprecedented, Kelthar finished. "The cultural barriers alone should make such a journey impossible. Most species can barely tolerate extended contact with 1 or 2 alien cultures, let alone 11. They entered the observation deck overlooking Docking Bay 7, and Hayes felt her breath catch. Through the massive viewport, she could see the ship's crew beginning to disembark. They moved not as separate groups, maintaining careful distances from one another, but as a single integrated community. Species she recognized from previous refugee ships worked alongside others she had never seen before, all displaying a level of cooperation that defied everything she thought she knew about galactic sociology. "Commander," her communications officer called from the control station. "We're receiving a transmission from the ship's captain. Put it through." The holographic display activated, revealing a figure that took Hayes a moment to process. The captain appeared to be Bractatul, one of the Concord's most respected military species, but his armor bore none of the traditional markings of rank or house affiliation. Instead, it had been modified with technical elements she recognized as Zek-Kari computational interfaces, artistic flourishes that looked Malthine in origin, and practical improvements that seemed distinctly human in their approach. "I am Captain Thokmar of the vessel Second Chance," the figure said, his translated voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "We request sanctuary in human space, not as refugees from our individual worlds, but as citizens of something new." Hayes activated her own transmission system. "Captain Thokmar. I'm Commander Hayes, administrator of this station. You're welcome here, of course, but I need to understand citizens of what exactly?" The Bractul captain's mandibles clicked in what Hayes had learned to recognize as their species equivalent of a bitter smile. "Citizens of nowhere, Commander. We are the ones who dared to suggest that the galaxy could be better. We are the ones who believed that cooperation between species could go beyond mere tolerance to actual unity. We are the ones who proposed that the Concord's vision was too small, too limited, too afraid. The Concordat exiled you for political dissent. The Concordat destroyed our lives for daring to dream," came a new voice as another figure stepped into the transmission range. This one was clearly Veltai, but like the Bractul captain, her appearance had been modified with elements from multiple cultures. "They confiscated our research, disbanded our coalition, and marked us as culturally dangerous individuals to be monitored and contained." Hayes felt a chill run down her spine. She had thought humanity's refugees were outcasts and unfortunates, victims of circumstances beyond their control. But this was something different. This was active persecution for having the wrong ideas. "What kind of research?" she asked. The Veltai stepped forward. "We were developing models for true interspecies integration. Not just diplomatic cooperation or trade agreements, but actual unified societies where multiple species could live and work together as equals. We had prototype communities, successful experiments that had been running for decades. And the Concordat shut them down?" "More than that," Captain Thokmar replied. "They declared such communities to be unnatural aberrations that threatened the fundamental order of galactic civilization. Our research was classified as Sitchus material. Our communities were forcibly disbanded. Our families were separated and relocated to prevent further contamination." Hayes looked out at the ship's crew again, seeing them with new eyes. They weren't just refugees. They were revolutionaries. Peaceful ones, perhaps, but revolutionaries nonetheless. And they had come to humanity because you've been doing exactly what we were trying to prove was possible, the Veltai said, as if reading her thoughts. In 6 months you've created what we spent decades trying to build. You've proven that our theories weren't just wishful thinking. Commander, Kelthar whispered urgently. If the Concordat considers these people dangerous enough to exile, taking them in could be seen as an act of aggression. Hayes looked at the young Nethys, then back at the transmission. The Brektul captain and Veltai scientist were watching her with expressions that somehow transcended species barriers, hope mixed with resignation, the look of people who had been disappointed too many times to truly believe in salvation, but were still desperate enough to try. Captain Thakmar, she said finally, how long do you need to fully disembark your people? Approximately 6 hours, Commander. Take 8. We'll have temporary housing prepared and integration specialists standing by. She paused, meeting the captain's eyes through the transmission. And Captain, welcome to Earth space. All of you. As the transmission ended and Hayes began issuing orders for the largest refugee integration effort in human history, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just changed. Humanity had started by offering sanctuary to the galaxy's outcasts. Now they were harboring its political dissidents, its dreamers, its dangerous idealists. The universe hadn't just turned its back on these people, it had actively driven them away for daring to imagine something better. But perhaps that was exactly what humanity needed. Perhaps what the galaxy needed was a place where dangerous ideas could grow, where impossible dreams could take root, where the outcasts and visionaries could build something the established order had never imagined. Outside the viewport, the stars remained unchanged. But Hayes had the distinct feeling that wouldn't last much longer. High Arbiter Zenmalik's energy form flickered with patterns that his species reserved for moments of profound concern. The weekly intelligence briefings had become exercises in increasingly disturbing revelations, each report more troubling than the last. The humans now harbor refugees from 67 different species. Councillor Rixton reported, his massive frame occupying nearly a quarter of the council chamber. Their population of non-human residents has exceeded 12 million individuals. 12 million, whispered Councillor Yevandra, her Malthine form rippling with distaste. In 2 years, that's more than most concorded worlds except in a century. Zenmalik processed the numbers with growing unease. When the Council had first rejected humanity's admission, the decision had been based on careful analysis and measured consideration. Humans were too violent, too unpredictable, too young to contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization. The isolation protocol had been a kindness, really, a way to let them develop in peace without the pressures of galactic politics. But the intelligence reports painted a very different picture of what that isolation had wrought. Tell me about this coalition they've formed, Zenmalik requested. The chamber's central holographic display activated, showing a 3-dimensional map of human space. What had once been a small cluster of star systems around a single unremarkable world had expanded into something that defied easy categorization. Dozens of stations, hundreds of settlements, a network of trade routes and communication relays that connected species who had never successfully coexisted anywhere else in the galaxy. They call it the Free Systems Alliance, Rixthon continued, his voice carrying undertones of grudging respect. It's not a government in any traditional sense. More like a voluntary association of independent communities united by shared principles. What principles? Yevandra asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be comforting. Mutual aid, open borders, self-determination, and… Rixthon paused, consulting his datapad. Universal welcome. Any being, any species, any community that seeks sanctuary is guaranteed acceptance and support. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. The Concordat had spent 3 millennia carefully managing the galaxy's refugee populations, using admission criteria and bureaucratic processes to ensure that displacement crises didn't overwhelm established systems. It was a delicate balance, one that required saying no far more often than yes. Humanity had simply said yes to everyone. The economic projections, Zenmalik said slowly. Surely this level of refugee integration must be causing massive instability. Resource shortages, social tensions, infrastructure collapse. That's what we expected, admitted Councillor Telvash, whose Zeth-Keri species served as the Concordat's primary economic analysts. But the data suggests the opposite. The Free Systems Alliance is experiencing unprecedented growth in both technological innovation and economic output. The holographic display shifted to show economic indicators that made Zenmalik's energy patterns fluctuate with confusion. Industrial production was up 340% compared to pre-refugee levels. Scientific research output had increased by over 500%. Trade volume between alliance systems had grown exponentially, creating a robust internal economy that was becoming increasingly independent of concordate markets. How is this possible? Diversity synergy, Telvash explained, his crystalline form chiming with analytical precision. Each species brings unique capabilities and perspectives. The humans appear to have created an environment where these differences enhance rather than conflict with each other. Give me an example. The Korthak refugee population brought advanced metallurgy techniques. The Velnanari contributed theoretical physics breakthroughs. The Zuntith provided cultural frameworks for conflict resolution. The humans somehow synthesized all of this into new technologies and social structures that none of the individual species could have developed alone. Zenmalik's form dimmed as he processed this information. The Concordat's approach had always been based on careful separation, each species contributing their specialty while maintaining distinct cultural boundaries. The idea that true integration might actually be more productive than managed separation challenged fundamental assumptions about galactic civilization. There's more, Rixthon said quietly. The political refugees from 2 years ago, the ones who were expelled for advocating interspecies integration, they've been producing research that's troubling. Troubling. They've developed models for galactic governance that could theoretically scale to encompass the entire known universe. Not through conquest or absorption, but through voluntary participation in a truly multi-species democracy. The words hung in the chamber like a poison cloud. For 3,000 years, the Concordat had maintained stability through careful hierarchy, established species guiding younger ones, proven systems managing chaotic elements, order imposed from above to prevent the galaxy from descending into chaos. What the humans were proposing was the exact opposite. Order emerging from below, stability created through inclusion rather than exclusion, governance based on consent rather than authority. It's theoretical fantasy, Yvandra said dismissively. No government could possibly manage the complexity of dozens of species with radically different needs and values. The Alliance is managing 93 different species across 47 star systems, Telvash noted. And their satisfaction indices are higher than anything we've recorded in Concordat space. The chamber fell silent again. Finally, Zenmalik's energy form pulsed with decision. What are our options? We could lift the isolation protocol, suggested Quinthera. The Veltai ambassador had requested permission to address the council specifically on this matter, and her presence served as a reminder that not everyone agreed with the current approach. Open diplomatic relations. Begin formal discussions about— Absolutely not, Rixthon interrupted. The moment we legitimize their approach, we undermine the fundamental principles of Concordat governance. Every malcontent and revolutionary in the galaxy will see it as validation. They'll see it as hope, Quintara countered. The same hope that's driven 12 million beings to seek sanctuary in human space. Hope for what? The complete dissolution of established order. The end of civilized governance. Yovandra's form rippled with indignation. Ambassador, surely you can see the danger in what you're proposing. I can see the danger in what we're ignoring, Quintara replied, her 6 arms gesturing toward the holographic display. Look at those numbers again. Look at what they've accomplished. We rejected the humans because we thought they were too primitive to contribute to galactic civilization. But what if we were wrong? What if they're not too primitive? What if we're too limited? The question struck the chamber like a physical blow. For a moment no one spoke. Then Zenmalik's energy form flared with sudden intensity. The isolation protocol remains in effect, he declared. Furthermore, I'm authorizing enhanced monitoring of human space. We need detailed intelligence on their capabilities, their intentions, and their weaknesses. High Arbiter Quinivera said carefully. Enhanced monitoring could be interpreted as a prelude to military action. The humans have made their intentions clear, Ambassador. They are actively undermining Concord authority by harboring political dissidents and promoting seditious ideologies. If they continue on this path, military action may become necessary. Quinivera felt her heart racing as the implications sank in. The humans had done nothing but offer sanctuary to the desperate and hope to the hopeless. But from the Concordat's perspective, that generosity was an existential threat. High Arbiter, I must respectfully request permission to establish unofficial contact with the human leadership. If there's a peaceful resolution to this situation, permission denied. The isolation protocol applies to all Concordat citizens, including council members. Zen Malik's energy patterns had taken on the rigid geometry that indicated final decision. This session is concluded. As the council members began to disperse, Quintara remained in her seat, staring at the holographic display that still showed the Free Systems Alliance in all its chaotic, beautiful complexity. Somewhere in that network of lights and connections, humanity was proving that the galaxy could be better than it was. But the Concordat would rather destroy that proof than admit they had been wrong. President Maria Santos stood in the observation deck of humanity's newest and largest space station, watching supply ships arrive from across the Alliance. Each vessel represented a small miracle of cooperation. Korvac refined metals being delivered alongside Velinari computational cores, Sunafik agricultural supplies sharing cargo space with human-manufactured medical equipment. Madam President? Admiral Patricia Hendricks approached, with a datapad and an expression that Santos had learned to associate with complicated news. We've got the monthly intelligence summary. Santos accepted the pad, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency. The numbers continued to amaze her: population growth, economic expansion, technological breakthroughs. By any objective measure, the Alliance was the most successful multi-species society in recorded galactic history. But success, she had learned, sometimes made enemies. The Concordat monitoring stations are getting closer, she observed, noting the positions of surveillance platforms that had been steadily encroaching on Alliance territory. Close enough to be a concern. Yes, ma'am. They're not violating our territorial boundaries, but they're collecting detailed intelligence on our ship movements, communication patterns, and defensive capabilities. Santos set down the datapad and looked out at the stars. 2.5 years ago, she had been the leader of a small, isolated species, desperately hoping for acceptance among the galactic community. Now she found herself at the head of an alliance that represented nearly 100 different species and challenged the fundamental assumptions of that same galactic community. What's the assessment from our Concordat refugees? Any insight into their likely next moves? Hendricks consulted her notes. Captain Thokmar believes they're building a case for military intervention. The monitoring stations are positioned to provide targeting data and tactical intelligence. Yiltana from the Veltai thinks they're looking for an excuse, some action we might take that they can paint as aggressive or destabilizing. And what does Commander Hayes think? She thinks we're missing the bigger picture. Ifan Mykirks pulled up a different section of the report. The refugee applications aren't slowing down. If anything, they're accelerating. We're receiving over 1,000 requests for sanctuary every day now. But the demographic is shifting. Santos raised an eyebrow. How so? It's not just outcasts and political dissidents anymore. We're getting applications from Concordat citizens, people with established lives in mainstream society who are choosing to leave everything behind to join the Alliance. The implications hit Santos like a physical weight. When they had started accepting refugees, it had been an act of compassion toward those who had nowhere else to go. But if they were now attracting people who had other options, people who were voluntarily leaving the established order, they're not fleeing to us, she said slowly. They're choosing us. Yes, ma'am. And that's going to scare the Concordat more than any weapon we could build. Santos moved to the observation deck's central console, calling up a display of recent refugee interviews. The faces that appeared represented dozens of species, but their expressions were remarkably similar. Hope mixed with determination, the look of people who had found something worth believing in. A Breck tool engineer who had left a prestigious position to help build Alliance infrastructure. a molten artist whose work had been censored by her homeworld's cultural authorities, a young Zethakari programmer who had grown frustrated with the rigid hierarchies of Concordat research institutions. "Ma'am?" Hendrix's voice drew her attention back to the present. "There's something else. We've been monitoring Concordat communication networks. Nothing classified, just public broadcasts, and there's been a significant shift in public opinion." "What kind of shift?" "Support for the Alliance is growing. Not just among marginalized populations, but among mainstream citizens. There are protest movements on 17 Concordat worlds demanding that their governments open relations with us." Santos felt a chill run down her spine. Popular movements demanding change, established governments feeling threatened, military forces positioning for potential conflict. She had studied enough history to know where this pattern led. "Admiral, I need you to convene an emergency session of the Alliance Council and send a message to all member species. We need to begin preparing for the possibility that the Concordat may view our continued existence as an unacceptable threat." "You think they'll attack?" Santos looked out at the stars one more time, seeing not the peaceful cosmos she had once imagined, but a vast arena where different visions of civilization were about to collide. "I think they're terrified, Admiral, and terrified governments don't usually make rational decisions." Fleet Admiral Kexthal stood before the largest assembly of military commanders in Concordat history. Representatives from 47 species filled the amphitheater, their varied forms united by the common insignia of military authority and shared concern about the growing Alliance threat. "The situation has escalated beyond containment," he announced, his bractal voice carrying the weight of centuries of military tradition. "Intelligence reports indicate that the Free Systems Alliance now controls territory equivalent to a major Concordat sector. Their military capabilities, while still inferior to ours, are growing at an unprecedented rate." The holographic display behind him showed the most recent strategic analysis. Alliance space had grown to encompass over 60 star systems, with defensive installations and patrol fleets that represented a genuine challenge to Concordat authority in the region. "More concerning," Kexthal continued, "is the political situation. We now have confirmed reports of active rebellion movements on 23 Concordat worlds, all inspired by Alliance ideology and demanding governmental reforms that would effectively end Concordat authority as we know it." A ripple of unease passed through the assembled commanders. The Concordat military had been designed to maintain order through overwhelming superiority and the implicit threat of force, but they had never faced a challenge that attacked the very legitimacy of that order. "What are our strategic options?" asked Admiral Yefmel of the Molfine fleet, her ethereal form pulsing with tactical calculations. "Three primary approaches have been identified," Kexthal replied, activating tactical displays that showed potential battle scenarios. "First, containment. We establish a military cordon around Alliance space, preventing further expansion and cutting off their recruitment of refugees." "Effectiveness?" came a question from the Zathakari section. "Limited. Intelligence suggests the Alliance has developed faster-than-light communication networks that bypass our monitoring systems. They can continue coordinating with sympathetic populations throughout Concordat space regardless of physical containment." The second display activated, showing a more aggressive formation of fleet movements. "Second option, surgical strikes. We target critical Alliance infrastructure, command centers, shipyards, communication hubs, while avoiding civilian casualties." "Political ramifications?" asked the Veltai commander. "Severe. Any military action against the Alliance will be seen as an attack on refugee populations and political dissidents. It could trigger the very uprisings we're trying to prevent." The third display was the most comprehensive, showing fleet movements that would dwarf any military operation in Concordat history. "Third option, total pacifications. We deploy overwhelming force to completely dismantle the Alliance, relocate all refugee populations to supervised settlements, and establish permanent military governance over the region." The amphitheater fell silent as commanders absorbed the implications. Total pacification would mean the end of the isolation protocol, the acknowledgement that humanity and their allies represented a threat requiring complete military subjugation. "Casualties?" someone asked quietly. "Projected civilian deaths between 8 and 12 million. Military casualties, variable depending on resistance levels. Duration of pacification operations, 18 to 36 months. Long-term occupation requirements, indefinite. Fleet Admiral Kexthal deactivated the displays and faced his commanders directly. The High Council meets tomorrow to decide our course of action. Your recommendations will be forwarded through proper channels. As the assembly began to disperse, Admiral Yithmal approached the podium. Her Maltene wisdom sight allowed her to perceive patterns and connections that other species often missed, and what she saw in the current situation troubled her deeply. Admiral Kexthal, she said quietly, has anyone calculated what happens if we succeed? Success parameters are clearly defined in the strategic analysis. No, she interrupted. I mean what happens to us if we succeed? What happens to the Concordat if we solve the alliance problem through military force? Kexthal's massive frame shifted uncomfortably. The Concordat will continue to provide stable governance for the galaxy, as it has for 3 millennia. Will it? Yithmal's form flickered with patterns of deep concern. For 3,000 years we've maintained order through the implicit threat that non-compliance would result in exclusion. Isolation, economic sanctions, political pressure, but we've never had to follow through on the ultimate threat. What are you saying, Admiral? I'm saying that the moment we deploy military force to crush a population whose only crime was offering sanctuary to refugees, we become something we've never been before. We become conquerors. And once you cross that line, she let the words hang in the air, knowing that Kexthal's military training would fill in the implications. Once a government decided that its authority came from force rather than consent, every future challenge would be met with more force. The careful balance of cooperation and voluntary compliance that had kept the galaxy stable for millennia would be replaced by the constant threat of violence. The High Council has made its priorities clear, Admiral Yithmal. Yes, she said sadly. They have. The emergency session had been called for 0800 hours, but representatives had been arriving throughout the night. Captain Jonathan Cross looked around the circular chamber, marveling at the diversity of beings who had somehow learned to work together as a unified government. Tokumar represented the Braktu refugees, his modified armor glinting with technological improvements that represented the best of a dozen different engineering traditions. Dr. Ilthana spoke for the Veltai population, her 6 arms moving in graceful patterns as she discussed refugee integration statistics with a Corfac mining coordinator. At the center of it all sat President Santos, her human features showing the strain of leading a civilization that had grown beyond anything anyone had imagined possible. In less than 3 years, she had gone from being the president of Earth to being the de facto leader of the largest multi-species democracy in galactic history. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all configurations, she began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's translation systems. We're here because our intelligence services have detected a significant escalation in Concordat military preparations. Admiral Hendricks will brief us on the situation. The holographic display activated, showing fleet movements throughout Concordat space that painted an unmistakable picture. Warships being recalled from patrol duties, support vessels being repositioned, communication networks showing the patterns of coordinated military planning. They're preparing for war, Hendricks said bluntly. Not limited engagement, not surgical strikes, total war. The force concentrations we're detecting suggest they're planning to end the alliance as a political entity. A wave of distressed sounds passed through the chamber, clicks, chirps, harmonic resonances, and other expressions of alarm that represented dozens of species' reactions to existential threat. What are our defensive capabilities? Asked Commander Reliktek, a former Concordat military officer whose species had been quietly purged from the fleet for asking uncomfortable questions about military ethics. Insufficient for direct confrontation, Hendricks admitted. We have patrol fleets, defensive installations, and rapid response capabilities. But against the full might of the Concordat military, we'd be facing odds of approximately 50 to 1. Then we evacuate, said Dr. Yiltana, her Veltai pragmatism cutting through the emotional response. We have ships. We have mobile populations. We scatter throughout the galaxy, establish new communities, continue our work in smaller, less visible groups, and abandon everyone who can't leave? President Santos asked quietly. The elderly, The sick, the communities that have spent years building new lives here. We just walk away and let the Concordat deal with them as they see fit? The chamber fell silent. Everyone present knew what dealing with them would mean. Forced relocation, separation of families, the dissolution of communities that represented decades of careful cultural integration. There's another option, said Captain Thokmar, his deep voice carrying the weight of military experience. We don't run, and we don't fight. We do what we've been doing from the beginning. We welcome them. Welcome who? Asked Santos. The Concordat fleets, the military commanders, the soldiers who are about to be ordered to destroy everything we've built. Thokmar stood, his massive frame commanding attention. What if, instead of preparing for war, we prepared for the largest refugee integration effort in Alliance history? The suggestion was so unexpected that several representatives began speaking at once, creating a cacophony of translated voices that took several minutes to sort out. When order was finally restored, Santos was staring at the former Concordat military officer with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. You're suggesting we offer sanctuary to the people who are coming to destroy us? I'm suggesting we remember who we are, Thokmar replied. We're the alliance that says yes to everyone. We're the civilization that welcomes the unwanted. We're the society that believes everyone deserves a chance to belong. But they're military personnel under orders. They're individuals who joined the military to protect and serve their communities. When they see what we've actually built here, when they meet the people they've been told are dangerous revolutionaries, when they realize they're being asked to commit genocide against refugee populations, Thokmar's mandibles clicked with grim humor. Some of them are going to have a very hard time following those orders. Dr. Yelthana's 6 arms moved in patterns of deep consideration. It's unprecedented. No military force in galactic history has ever faced that kind of ideological challenge. Because no military force in galactic history has ever been asked to attack a society that embodies everything they claim to fight for, added Commander Relateig. Protection of the weak, defense of the innocent, justice and compassion. President Santos stood, moving to the chamber's central console. With a few commands, she brought up the Alliance Charter, the document that had been drafted in the early days when they had thought they were just managing a refugee crisis. Article 7. She read aloud, the Alliance commits to welcoming any being, any community, any society that seeks refuge from oppression, violence or persecution, regardless of their past affiliations or previous actions, provided they renounce violence and commit to the principles of mutual aid and cooperation. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes and optical sensors and other sensory organs of representatives from 93 different species. The question before us is simple. Do we mean it? Do we really mean it? Even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous, even when the people seeking refuge are wearing the uniforms of an army coming to destroy us. The debate that followed lasted 18 hours. Representatives argued, pleaded, calculated risks, and explored possibilities that challenged every assumption about warfare, diplomacy, and civilization itself. When the vote was finally called, it wasn't even close. Unanimous approval for the most audacious act of faith in galactic history. The Free Systems Alliance would prepare for war by preparing to forgive their enemies. Concordat Battlefleet Epsilon approaching Alliance territory. Commander Vaxiclaw stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Righteous Purpose, watching Alliance space grow larger on the tactical displays. Around her, the largest military fleet in Concordat history moved with the coordinated precision that had maintained galactic order for 3 millennia. 47 dreadnoughts, 300 cruisers, over 1,000 support vessels. The combined military might of every species in the Concordat, united for the first time since the great consolidation wars that had established their civilization. It should have felt inspiring. Instead, Vexcala found herself troubled by doubts that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Commander, her tactical officer reported, we're receiving another transmission from the Alliance fleet. The same message? Yes, ma'am. No defensive posturing, no threats, no demands. Just this. The communication activated, filling the bridge with a voice that Vaxiclaw had heard dozens of times now. President Santos of Earth speaking directly to the Concord forces with a sincerity that was becoming impossible to ignore. To the brave men, women, and beings serving in the Concordat fleet, we know you're coming. We know you have your orders. We know you believe you're protecting galactic civilization from a dangerous threat. We want you to know that you're welcome here. Not as conquerors or as enemies, but as individuals who have spent their lives in service to their communities. If any among you have doubts about this mission, if any of you want to see for yourselves what we've actually built here, if any of you believe there might be a better way, you are welcome. We have prepared facilities for anyone who chooses to stay. We have integration specialists who have helped thousands of refugees find new lives among us. We have communities that include members of your own species who chose hope over fear. You are not our enemies. We're people following orders you may not fully believe in. And if you want to stop following those orders, if you want to be part of building something better instead of destroying something good, then you have a place here. This is President Santos, and this is our promise. The Alliance will always choose welcome over warfare. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in uncomfortable silence. Vexala had heard the message so many times that she had memorized every inflection, every pause, every note of genuine compassion in the human president's voice. "Ma'am?" her communications officer asked quietly. "Orders?" Vexala looked around the bridge, seeing her crew's expressions reflected in the polished surfaces of their control stations. These were professional military personnel, trained to follow orders without question, but she could see the doubt in their postures, the uncertainty in their movements. "Maintain course and speed," she said finally, "and keep monitoring their transmissions." As the fleet continued its approach, Vexala couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to participate in something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The Alliance had made no aggressive moves, had issued no threats, had prepared no visible defenses. Instead, they had spent the past month broadcasting personal messages from refugees representing every species in the Concordate fleet. Rectul engineers describing the infrastructure projects they were building. Veltai scientists explaining research that had been forbidden in Concordat space. Maltese scientists explaining research that had been forbidden in Concordat space. Maltese scientists explaining research that had been forbidden in Concordat space. Maltese scientists explaining research that had been forbidden in Concordat space. It was psychological warfare of the most insidious kind. Warfare that attacked not the body or the mind but the conscience. "Commander," her tactical officer called urgently, "we have Alliance vessels approaching. Battle stations." "Ma'am, they're not armed." "Repeat, we're detecting no weapons signatures. They appear to be civilian transports?" Vexala moved to the tactical station, staring at readings that made no sense. 12 Alliance ships were indeed approaching the Concordat fleet, but they were moving slowly, broadcasting continuous identification signals, and showing power signatures consistent with passenger vessels rather than warships. "What are they doing?" "Unknown, ma'am. They're requesting permission to dock." "To dock with military vessels during an active combat deployment?" "Yes, ma'am. They're broadcasting passenger manifests and requesting clearance to transfer refugees." Vexala felt the bridge around her shift into surreal impossibility. They were being invaded by ships full of refugees who wanted to surrender to the invading army. "Commander," her communications officer said quietly, "I'm receiving personal messages addressed to crew members by name." "What kind of personal messages?" "Family members, ma'am. Relatives who emigrated to Alliance space and want to see their loved ones before the shooting starts." The tactical display updated, showing Alliance ships taking position near every major vessel in the Concordat fleet. Not attack positions, parking positions. As if they were planning to stay for an extended visit. "Get me Fleet Admiral Kexthal," Vexala ordered. Fleet Admiral Kexthal stared at the tactical display with growing bewilderment. In 40 years of military service, he had encountered every form of resistance, deception, and psychological manipulation known to galactic warfare. This was something entirely new. "Report," he demanded as his senior staff assembled in the war room. "The Alliance has deployed what they're calling a welcome fleet," his intelligence officer began. 12 passenger vessels carrying approximately 15,000 individuals representing 37 different species. Combatants? Refugees, sir. Families. Civilian specialists. Cultural ambassadors. And, the officer paused, consulting his datapad. Former Concordat military personnel who defected to the Alliance over the past 2 years. The vectors? How many? Preliminary identification suggests over 3,000 individuals with former Concordat military service. They're broadcasting personal messages to crew members they served with asking permission to meet face-to-face. Keksaxthol's massive frame shifted with frustration. A traditional enemy would attack or surrender. A clever enemy would try to outmaneuver or outfight the superior force. But an enemy that showed up wanting to have family reunions and cultural exchanges. What are the Alliance military formations doing? There are no Alliance military formations, sir. Their defense fleets have withdrawn to minimum patrol positions around civilian populations. They're not preparing to fight us, they're preparing to host us. The War Room's main display activated, showing intercepts of Alliance internal communications. Rather than military commands and tactical deployments, the traffic was dominated by logistics coordinators preparing visitor facilities, cultural liaison officers, scheduling meetings, and refugee integration specialists, offering their services to potential Concordat defectors. Sir, his communications officer interrupted. We're receiving a transmission from Alliance leadership requesting permission to come aboard. To surrender? To welcome us, sir. President Santos is asking if you'd like to tour their facilities, meet with refugee communities, and discuss the possibility of a peaceful resolution to this situation. Keksaxtol stared at the display for a long moment, his military training warring with a growing sense that the situation had moved far beyond anything his experience had prepared him for. Admiral? His chief of staff asked quietly. Your orders? Deny the request. All ships are to maintain positions and await further instructions. And get me a secure channel to Concordat Command. I need to speak with the High Council immediately. President Santos sat in the emergency command center that had been hastily established beneath the Alliance Council chambers, surrounded by communication displays showing real-time feeds from across their territory. The approaching Concordat fleet dominated the tactical screens, but the information flowing in from Alliance ships positioned near the enemy formation told a very different story than anyone had expected. Report from Welcome Ship 7. Admiral Hendricks called from her position at the communications console. They've processed 43 requests for asylum from Concordat fleet personnel in the past 6 hours. 43 defections already? Santos asked, hardly daring to believe the numbers. Not defections. Request for information. Crew members asking to speak with relatives who emigrated to Alliance space. Officers requesting clarification about Alliance policies and integration procedures. Engineers asking about civilian job opportunities. Hendricks paused, consulting her displays. It's like they're shopping for a new life instead of preparing for a war. Captain Thokmar, who had been monitoring communications from his former colleagues in the Concordat military, looked up from his console with an expression of amazed vindication. It's working. The personal approach is working. Military personnel are trained to follow orders, but they're not trained to resist compassion. What's the status on family reunion requests? Over 2,000 and climbing, replied Dr. Yilthana, who had been coordinating the refugee outreach program. We have Braktul crew members with siblings in Alliance space, Veltai officers with children who emigrated for educational opportunities, Molten personnel with artistic relatives who found creative freedom here. Santos moved to the central display, which showed not battle lines but connection patterns. Thousands of individual relationships linking the two forces in ways that military planners had never anticipated. Every refugee who had joined the Alliance had left behind family members, friends, colleagues, and communities in Concordat space. And now those connections were being activated on an Ma'am, Admiral Hendricks called urgently. We're receiving a priority transmission from Concordat Fleet Command. Admiral Keksaxtol wants to speak with you directly. Sent. The display activated, showing the bridge of a Concordat dreadnought and the imposing figure of Fleet Admiral Keksaxtol. His Braktul features were set in an expression of professional authority, but Santos could see uncertainty in his posture. President Santos. he began, without preamble. I am Fleet Admiral Kexthewel of the Concordate Defense Forces. You are in violation of interstellar law by harboring political dissidents and undermining legitimate governmental authority. I am authorized to demand your immediate surrender and the disbanding of this illegal alliance. Santos nodded respectfully. Admiral Kexthewel, I'm honored to meet you, even under these circumstances. Before we discuss legal technicalities, I'd like to ask you a personal question. Do you have family members serving in your fleet? The question clearly caught Kexthewel off guard. That is not relevant. It's entirely relevant, Admiral, because I'm betting that some of your crew members have relatives living in Alliance space. I'm betting some of your officers have been receiving personal messages from people they haven't seen in years. I'm betting that right now your military operation is being complicated by the fact that the people you're supposed to attack are the same people who welcomed your own families when they had nowhere else to go. Kexthewel's expression hardened. Personal relationships do not override duty and legal authority. No, they don't. Santos agreed. But they do raise questions about whether that duty and authority are being exercised wisely. Admiral, I'm going to make you an offer that has never been made to an invading military force in galactic history. I'm listening. Come aboard our station, not to surrender, as my guest. Tour our facilities. Meet the people you've been told are dangerous revolutionaries. See what we've actually built here. And then if you still believe we represent a threat that must be eliminated, we'll discuss terms for our surrender. The transmission fell silent for several long seconds. Santos could see Kexthewel's staff in the background. Their body language. And if I refuse your invitation? Then you'll have to attack a civilian population that includes thousands of members of your own species, many of whom are family members of your own personnel. You'll have to explain to your fleet why they're being ordered to destroy communities that have committed no crime beyond offering sanctuary to refugees. Another long pause. Finally, Kexthewel spoke with careful precision. I will consider your proposal, President Santos. But understand this. I have my orders. If I determine that the Alliance represents a clear and present danger to galactic stability, I will carry out those orders regardless of personal considerations. I understand, Admiral, and I respect your sense of duty. All I'm asking is that you base that determination on facts rather than fears. The transmission ended, leaving the command center in tense silence. Santos looked around at her staff, seeing their own doubts reflected in their expressions. They had just gambled the existence of their civilization on the hope that even military officers trained for absolute obedience would hesitate to destroy something beautiful. Ma'am? Admiral Hendricks asked quietly. What if he says no? Santos looked back at the tactical display, where the welcome fleet continued its impossible mission of offering friendship to an approaching army. Then we'll have proven that we were right to build something better than the civilization that rejected us. Fleet Admiral Kexthewel stepped through the airlock accompanied by a security detail and a growing sense that he was walking into something far more dangerous than any battlefield. The docking bay that greeted them was a marvel of engineering that incorporated design elements from dozens of different species, creating a functional space that somehow managed to feel welcoming despite its massive scale. But it was the people waiting to meet them that truly stopped him short. The delegation wasn't composed of the human leadership he had expected. Instead, he found himself facing representatives from across Alliance space, including several dozen individuals wearing modified versions of Concordate military uniforms. Admiral Kexthewel, President Santos approached with the easy confidence of someone greeting an honored guest rather than an invading commander. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I'd like to introduce you to some people you may recognize. The first figure who stepped forward was unmistakably Braktul massive frame. Ceremonial armor, the bearing of a career military officer. But his insignia had been replaced with Alliance symbols, and his expression carried a peace that Kexthewel hadn't seen in his own species for years. Admiral, the figure said, offering the traditional Braktul salute. I am Captain Thokmar, formerly of the 47th Reconnaissance Division. I served under your command during the Outer Rim pacification. Kexthewel's memories snapped into focus. Commander Thokmar, you disappeared during the political purges 2 years ago. I was exiled for asking whether our military might was being used for justice or merely for control. The Alliance gave me an answer. Thokmar gestured toward the bustling activity around them. They gave me a chance to use my training to build rather than break. Before Kexthal could respond, another figure approached, Veltai but wearing the insignia of a Concordat science officer. Admiral, I am Dr. Yelthana. We've never met, but I served on the research station you defended during the Kanit uprising. You're the xenobiologist who was cashiered for conducting unauthorized research. Research into peaceful coexistence between species with incompatible biologies, she corrected gently. Research that has allowed the Alliance to integrate life forms that Concordat scientists declared fundamentally incompatible. One by one, Kexthal was introduced to former Concordat personnel who had found new lives within the Alliance. Engineers working on infrastructure projects that spanned multiple species' needs. Scientists pursuing research that had been forbidden in Concordat space. Military officers using their skills to protect refugee populations rather than enforce political compliance. This is impressive theater, Kexthal said finally, his professional skepticism reasserting itself. But it doesn't change the fundamental issues. You're undermining legitimate governmental authority, harboring political dissidents, and promoting ideologies that threaten galactic stability. President Santos nodded seriously. You're absolutely right, Admiral. We are doing all of those things. The question is, should we stop? She led them through corridors that buzzed with activity representing dozens of species working together in ways that defied everything Kexthal thought he knew about interspecies relations. They passed research laboratories where former enemies collaborated on breakthrough technologies, cultural centers where artistic traditions from across the galaxy were being preserved and shared, and educational facilities where children from 93 different species learned together. How is this possible? He asked, despite himself, watching a group of young Brechtel working with human children on an engineering project. The cultural barriers alone should make this kind of integration impossible. It is impossible, agreed Dr. Yilthana, if you assume that different species can't learn to see past their differences. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the barriers exist because we've been taught to maintain them, not because they're natural or necessary? They entered a vast observation deck overlooking one of the Alliance's manufacturing centers. The facility sprawled across multiple levels, with production lines that incorporated the best technologies and techniques from every member species. But it was the workforce that truly amazed Kexthal. Thousands of beings from dozens of worlds working together with an efficiency that surpassed anything he had seen in Concordat space. Production output in this facility alone exceeds most entire Concordat sectors, President Santos noted. Not because we're driving people harder, but because we've eliminated the inefficiencies that come from keeping species separated and specialized. And the social tensions? The cultural conflicts? The religious incompatibilities? They exist, Santos admitted. But we've learned that most conflicts arise from scarcity and fear. When people have enough resources and feel secure in their place in society, they're remarkably good at working out their differences. Kexthal watched the production floor for several more minutes, his tactical mind automatically analyzing what he was seeing. The security requirements for maintaining order among so many different species should have been enormous. The administrative overhead for managing such complexity should have been overwhelming. The cultural sensitivity training alone should have required massive institutional resources. But the evidence before his eyes suggested that none of those assumptions were correct. Admiral, Captain Thokmar said quietly, there's something else you need to see. They took a transport to the station's residential sections, where Kexthal found himself in the strangest military briefing of his career. Instead of tactical displays and strategic analyses, he was shown family videos, personal letters, and cultural exchange programs. These are communications from your own fleet personnel, President Santos explained. Activating a holographic display, over the past 24 hours we've received more than 8,000 requests for information about Alliance citizenship procedures. The display showed message after message from Concordat military personnel expressing doubts about their mission, curiosity about Alliance society, and hope for alternatives to the impending conflict. They're your people, Admiral Thokmar said quietly. Trained by the same military academy you attended, raised with the same values of service and protection. And they're questioning whether destroying this place is really compatible with those values. Kexthal stared at the messages, recognizing names and faces of personnel who had served under his command for years. Officers he trusted, soldiers he respected, crew members whose judgment he valued. And they were telling him that something was fundamentally wrong with their mission. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "We want you to make a choice," Santos replied. "Not as a Concordat officer following orders, but as an individual with the capacity for moral judgment. Look at what we've built. Look at the people who found hope here. Look at your own personnel who are questioning whether this is really what they signed up to do." She moved to the observation window, gazing out at a view that showed Alliance ships and Concordat vessels in close proximity, their crews talking across the void instead of preparing for battle. Choose whether this should be destroyed or protected. Choose whether the galaxy is better served by maintaining the old order or allowing something new to grow. Choose whether civilization means control or compassion. Kexthal looked around at the former Concordat officers who had become Alliance citizens, at the impossible integration of species that should have been eternally incompatible, at the evidence of a society that had achieved what 3 millennia of Concordat governance had never imagined possible. And for the first time in his military career, Fleet Admiral Kexthal began to question his orders. High Arbiter Zenmalik's energy form flickered with patterns of barely controlled rage as he processed the reports from Fleet Admiral Kexthal. What should have been a straightforward military operation had devolved into the largest mass desertion in Concordat military history. 18,000 defections in 72 hours, Councillor Rixton reported, his massive frame slumped with defeat, including 12 ship captains, 47 senior officers, and entire crew complements from 6 different vessels. "They're not defecting," Councillor Yavandra corrected, her ethereal form pulsing with distress. "They're requesting asylum. There's a difference." "The difference being," Zenmalik demanded. "Defection implies betrayal of one's principles. Asylum implies seeking protection from persecution. Our own military personnel are claiming that we've ordered them to commit atrocities against refugee populations." The council chamber fell into uncomfortable silence as the implications sank in. The Concordat had built its authority on the willing cooperation of member species, on the belief that their governance represented justice and stability. But when their own military forces began questioning the morality of their orders, "What is Admiral Kexthal's current status?" Zenmalik asked. "He's requested a 48-hour extension to complete his assessment of Alliance capabilities." Rixsenster replied reluctantly. "His latest reports suggest that the intelligence briefings we provided were incomplete. How? The Alliance isn't a collection of refugee camps held together by human charity. It's a functioning multi-species democracy with technological capabilities that rival our own and social integration models that surpass anything in Concordat space." Zenmalik's energy patterns shifted to configurations that his species hadn't used since their own homeworld's ancient wars. "Are you telling me that the Admiral is considering surrender?" "I'm telling you that the Admiral is considering whether the Alliance represents a threat that needs to be eliminated or an achievement that should be protected." The silence that followed was broken by Councillor Telvash, whose crystalline form chimed with analytical precision. "High Arbiter, I've completed the economic projections for continued military action against the Alliance. And, if we proceed with total pacification, the economic disruption will be catastrophic. The Alliance has become a major trading partner for 15 Concordat sectors, despite the official isolation protocol. Their technological innovations have been quietly adopted throughout our space. Their cultural exports have become popular across 47 worlds. Furthermore," added Councillor Quinthera, speaking for the first time during the session, "forcing our military to attack a civilian population that includes their own family members will create psychological trauma that could destabilize the entire Concordat defense force." Zenmalik's form dimmed as he processed the reports. Every option led to disaster. Backing down would acknowledge that the Alliance's challenge to Concordat authority was legitimate, but proceeding with the attack would require their military to commit what their own personnel were calling genocide against refugee populations. "What are our alternatives?" "There's one option we haven't considered," Quintera said quietly. "We could try to learn from them." "Learn what?" How to build a society where 93 different species choose to live together because they want to, not because they have to. How to create economic prosperity through cooperation rather than control. How to maintain order through compassion rather than force. Rickstone's rumbling laugh held no humor. You're suggesting we abandon 3,000 years of successful governance to experiment with untested ideologies. I'm suggesting that those ideologies are being tested right now and they're working better than ours. Quenther activated the chamber's display system, showing the latest reports from Alliance Space. Look at the numbers, Counselor. Look at the productivity indices, the satisfaction surveys, the innovation rates, the social stability measurements. The data painted a picture that challenged every assumption about galactic governance. The Alliance's multi-species democracy wasn't just functioning. It was thriving in ways that made Concord achievements look cautious and limited by comparison. Furthermore, Quintara continued, our isolation protocol has failed. We intended to prevent the spread of Alliance ideology, but instead we've created a symbol of resistance that's inspiring reform movements throughout Concordat space. What do you propose? Zen-Malik asked, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. We lift the isolation protocol. We open diplomatic relations with the Alliance, and we begin the process of transforming the Concordat from a hierarchical authority structure into something that can coexist with and learn from a true multi-species democracy. The proposal hit the chamber like a physical shockwave. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then Councillor Yvandra's form began to ripple with what could only be described as existential horror. You're talking about the end of everything we've built, the dissolution of the most stable government in galactic history, the abandonment of principles that have maintained peace for 3 millennia. I'm talking about evolution, Quintara replied. The same kind of evolution that allowed my own species to go from desperate refugees to respected council members. The same kind of growth that has allowed the Concordat to adapt to changing circumstances for 3,000 years. This is different, Rickstone protested. You're not talking about gradual reform, you're talking about revolution. Yes, Quintara agreed simply. Sometimes revolution is necessary. Sometimes the old ways stop working, and continuing to enforce them creates more suffering than change would. Zen-Malik's energy patterns shifted through configurations that reflected deep internal struggle. As High Arbiter, he had dedicated his existence to preserving and protecting the Concordat's authority. But as a being capable of moral reasoning, he couldn't ignore the evidence that this authority was being used to suppress something genuinely better. The vote, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of civilizational transformation, all in favor of lifting the isolation protocol and opening diplomatic relations with the Free Systems Alliance. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then slowly, lights began to pulse throughout the chamber. Not the overwhelming majority that had rejected humanity's original petition, but a careful, thoughtful consensus that recognized the universe had changed. 31 votes in favor. 16 opposed. The motion passes. Zen-Malik announced, the isolation protocol is hereby terminated. Ambassador Quintara, you are authorized to begin preliminary diplomatic contact with Alliance leadership. As the council began to disperse, Quintara remained in her seat, staring at the communication console that would allow her to make the call that would change everything. Somewhere in Alliance space, humanity and their refugee allies were waiting to learn whether they would be destroyed or welcomed. She activated the transmission system and began composing the most important message in galactic history. President Santos stood before the Alliance Council, holding a datapad that contained the most extraordinary diplomatic correspondence in galactic history. Around the chamber, representatives from 93 species waited to hear whether their experiment in multi-species democracy would survive its first existential crisis. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all configurations, she began, I've just received formal communication from the Galactic Concordat. High Arbiter Zen-Malik has officially lifted the isolation protocol and authorized the opening of diplomatic relations between our civilizations. The chamber erupted in expressions of joy, relief, and amazement that spanned dozens of species and cultures. But Santos raised her hand for silence, knowing that the real challenge was just beginning. However, she continued, this is not a surrender or a capitulation. The Concordat has also proposed something unprecedented, a joint commission to explore the possibility of fundamental governmental reform throughout both civilizations. Captain Thokmar leaned forward in his seat. What kind of reform? The gradual transformation of Concordat authority structures to incorporate alliance principles of voluntary association, open borders, and universal welcome. In essence, they're proposing to learn from our example and adapt their entire approach to galactic governance. Dr. Yulthana's 6 arms moved in patterns of deep consideration. The implications are staggering. If successful, such reforms could eliminate the need for refugee crises entirely. Every being in the galaxy would have a place where they belong. But it would also mean the end of the Concordat as we know it, added Commander Relatak. 3,000 years of institutional history, governmental structure, and cultural tradition. They're offering to abandon everything they've built to embrace our vision. Santos nodded, understanding the weight of the decision before them. The question is, do we trust them enough to try? Do we believe that cooperation is possible between our civilizations? Or do we assume this is an attempt to undermine our independence through diplomatic means? The debate that followed was unlike anything in Alliance history. For the first time, they weren't discussing how to help refugees or integrate displaced populations. They were discussing whether to trust their former enemies with the power to reshape galactic civilization. There's another consideration, said Elder Morthek, one of the oldest Zuntep refugees and a respected voice of wisdom within the Alliance. What happens to us if we say no? The chamber fell silent as representatives contemplated the alternative. Rejecting the Concordat's offer would likely mean a return to isolation, continued military pressure, and the constant threat of future conflict. But accepting it meant risking everything they had built on the hope that their former persecutors could change. I move that we accept the Concordat's proposal, Santos said finally, with the understanding that this commission will be guided by Alliance principles, transparency, voluntary participation, and the absolute right of any community to withdraw if they feel their values are being compromised. The vote was closer than their decision to welcome Concordat military deserters, but it still passed with a substantial majority. The Alliance would trust their enemies to become their partners. Ambassador Quintera stood in the observation deck of the newly constructed space station that had become the symbol of galactic transformation. Through the massive viewport, she could see ships from both the Alliance and the Concordat docked side by side, their crews working together on projects that would have been unimaginable a year ago. The Bractool integration protocols are exceeding all projections, reported Dr. Yulthana, who had become the Commission's chief architect of interspecies cooperation. We've successfully established 3 pilot communities where former Concordat military personnel are working alongside Alliance refugees. In the economic integration? Beyond our most optimistic estimates. The combination of Alliance innovation and Concordat infrastructure has created productivity improvements that are reshaping entire sectors of the galactic economy. Quintha reviewed the reports with growing amazement. The Joint Commission had been established with modest goals. Small-scale experiments in cooperation, limited cultural exchanges, careful pilot programs for governmental reform. But the results had been so successful that both civilizations were demanding accelerated implementation. What's the status on the Constitutional Convention? All member species have agreed to participate, replied Captain Thokmar, who had become the Commission's military liaison. We're looking at the largest gathering of galactic representatives in recorded history, over 300 species including 47 former Concordat members and 93 Alliance communities. The Constitutional Convention had been President Santos' idea, a gathering to draft a new framework for galactic governance that would incorporate the best elements of both civilizations. But what had started as a diplomatic gesture had evolved into something far more ambitious: the creation of the first truly universal government in galactic history. Ambassador, Dr. Yulthana said quietly, there's something else you should know. We've been receiving applications for membership from species outside both our civilizations, worlds that have heard about the Constitutional Convention and want to participate. How many applications? Over 200 so far, including several species that have never had contact with either the Concordat or the Alliance. Quintara moved to the viewport, watching the constant traffic of ships representing hundreds of different civilizations. In less than a year, humanity's simple act of welcoming refugees had grown into a movement that was reshaping the galaxy. The universe didn't just turn its back on humanity, she mused aloud. It turned its back on the idea that different peoples could truly live together in peace. And humanity proved that idea was worth fighting for. Not fighting, corrected President Santos, who had just entered the observation deck for their daily coordination meeting. Building. We didn't fight for our vision, we built it. And when people saw what we had built, they wanted to be part of it. The three of them stood together in comfortable silence, watching the impossible become routine. Ships from dozens of worlds, crews representing hundreds of species, all working together because they had chosen to believe that the galaxy could be better than it was. Madam President, Captain Thokmar said suddenly, incoming transmission from Earth. Priority 1. Santos activated her personal communicator, listening to a message that brought tears to her eyes. When she closed the connection, she was smiling with pure joy. Good news? Quintara asked. The best news. The Global Assembly has just voted to ratify the new Galactic Constitution. Earth is officially joining the United Worlds Federation. The name still felt new, still carried the weight of impossibility made real. The United Worlds Federation? A truly voluntary association of civilizations united not by force or fear but by shared values of compassion, cooperation, and universal welcome. How many ratifications do we have now? Dr. Yilfana asked. 347 worlds, Santos replied. With more joining every day. They returned to watching the traffic outside the viewport, seeing not just ships and space stations, but the visible manifestation of a dream that had started with humanity's rejection by the Galactic Concordate. That rejection had seemed like the end of hope. Instead, it had been the beginning of something no one had dared to imagine. Ambassador Quintara, Santos said quietly, I have a question I've wanted to ask for months. Yes? When you argued for humanity's admission to the Concordate, when you said we brought hope, did you have any idea what that hope would become? Quinthara's 6 arms moved in patterns of gentle amusement. Madam President, I thought you might build a small refugee settlement and gradually earn acceptance into galactic society. I never imagined you would rebuild galactic society entirely. And now I think the universe turned its back on humanity because it wasn't ready for what you represented. But humanity welcomed everyone the universe had rejected, and in doing so you proved that your way was better. Outside the viewport, another ship approached the station. This one bearing markings from a civilization so distant that its first contact protocols were still being established. Like hundreds before it, the ship carried beings who had heard about the Federation and wanted to see if the impossible stories were true. In a few hours they would dock. They would be welcomed. They would be offered sanctuary, community, and the chance to help build something better than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The universe had turned its back on humanity, but humanity had welcomed them all. And in doing so, they had proven that welcome was stronger than rejection, that hope was more powerful than fear, and that the simple act of saying yes to those the world had forgotten could reshape the cosmos itself. The memorial wall in the central plaza of Unity Station contained nearly 1 million names, refugees who had died before reaching safety, outcasts who had never found welcome, beings who had been rejected by a universe that valued order over compassion. President Santos stood before the wall, reading names she would never be able to pronounce, from species she had never met, who had died believing they were alone among the stars. The Federation now encompassed over 600 worlds and represented the largest voluntary government in galactic history. But these names reminded her that their success had come too late for too many. Madam President? The voice belonged to a young human aide, one of thousands of Federation citizens, who had grown up in a galaxy where rejection and isolation were historical curiosities rather than daily realities. The memorial service is about to begin. Santos nodded, taking one last look at the names. Behind her, representatives from hundreds of species were gathering for the annual ceremony that honored those who had never lived to see the galaxy they had dreamed of. As she walked toward the ceremony, Santos reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them here. Humanity's rejection by the Concordat had seemed like the end of their hopes for galactic citizenship. Instead, it had been the beginning of a transformation that had touched every corner of known space. The Federation's charter, inscribed in 600 languages on the station's central monument, contained the principle that had started it all. Every being has worth. Every community has value. Every species has something to contribute to the greater whole. We welcome all who seek peace, justice, and the chance to build something better together. Simple words. Revolutionary ideas, universal welcome. The universe had turned its back on humanity. But humanity had proven that turning your back on someone said more about you than it did about them. And in the end, that had made all the difference.